Welcome to the HashiCorp FSI users group today. We're so fortunate today that we have Larry Tan, a vice president from JP Morgan Chase, and Chris Hutchinson, an executive director from JP Morgan Chase. If you're not familiar with JP Morgan Chase, an American multinational investment bank and financial services holding company, headquartered here in New York City, but Larry and Chris are in the UK. JP Morgan Chase is ranked by S&P Global as the largest bank in the United States and the 7th largest bank in the world by total assets. We also have today with us our field CTO, Guy Sayer, who's going to interview Chris and Larry. Guy, take it away.
Thanks, Hope. Hi, everybody. Good to see you all. Hey, Chris, Larry, thanks for joining. You know, this is a little bit of a different session that we're doing today. It's not a presentation, really. It's more of an interactive dialogue. So I'm just going to open it up, ask Chris and Larry a few questions, but really feel free to post questions on the chat, and we'll create them and try to address them as we have time. Chris, Larry, over to you. Maybe you can just give us 2-3 minutes introduction to yourselves.
Sure. So first of all, Hope, thanks for stealing all those stats about JP Morgan that I was going to talk about. You probably know more about them than I do. It is quite funny because I guess for people in the States, JP Morgan Chase is a very well-known firm. In the UK, it actually isn't, because we don't have a retail bank here, so a lot of people aren't that familiar. So my name's Chris Hutchison. As has been said, I'm a director within JP Morgan in the public cloud space. Primarily, we've been working on AWS so far. We serve over about 50,000 technologists within the JP Morgan firm, and this is the platform that we're building out for public cloud. And I'm sure we'll dig into that a little bit further with the guys' questions. Larry, do you want to do a brief introduction too?
Sure. My name is Larry Tan. Thanks, Hope, and everyone for giving us this opportunity to share our experience on the Terraform cloud journey. I've been with the bank 7 to 8 years now. Background, always a software engineer. And in the recent couple of years, I've been passionate about cloud technologies and got myself into the role running a business of providing platform for JP Morgan's acceleration into the public cloud arena. That's me.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So this session is primarily around Terraform and the usage of Terraform and your journey. Just before we jump into it, help us kind of understand the complexity, the size. Tell us a little bit about, it's a large bank, but from your application and infrastructure perspective, the scale, the complexity.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. So as I kind of mentioned, JP Morgan as a firm's got 250,000 employees, which is a number that I struggle to comprehend. When you compare it to the population of Scotland, that's a big percentage of us. Of that, about 50,000 people are technologists, as I mentioned. So I guess what they like to say is that we're a technology company with a bank on the side. It's not quite true, but I mean, we have a huge technology employee number. As a result, there are thousands of applications out there. There's all types of applications, ones that we've built ourselves, ones that we've bought, third-party vendor products, etc., things that we host, and there's SaaS offerings and things like that as well. So if we talk about JP Morgan and public cloud, so as everyone on this call will be well aware of the compelling argument for using public cloud, JP Morgan are a bank. We're not really a data center provider. So the idea of having elastic compute that you can essentially rent, where AWS and the other providers can take on some of the responsibilities around physical securing of network, physical securing of buildings, procurement on patching, all that sort of stuff. There's a fairly good argument for us to use these like utilities in the same way that we don't provide our own power or our own operating systems or anything like that. We want to start using the power of these products that are, I guess, commoditized by providers like Amazon. But as you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of controls that we need to be careful before public cloud, or even within our private cloud, or anything within our own VSIs and physical devices. I guess we had some level of security and safety that the network engineers had basically isolated us from the big bad world, and we didn't have to worry so much about data leakage, etc. With moving towards public cloud, that's something we need to be very, very aware of. So, bit of a boring story there so far, but what the rationale for telling you this is that we had an option when we started to look at public cloud, and I say we, I mean the firm, and I mean several layers higher than me in the food chain, had an option of what they could do with letting teams use public cloud. If we let's say for argument's sake there's 1,000 development teams out there, at one extreme we could say to those 1,000 development teams, you guys have got credit cards, you guys can pay your own bills, off you go and get yourself AWS accounts and do what you will. Had we done that, then, and that's obviously extreme, if we'd done that, then you have 1,000 teams all independently trying to solve the same problems around cyber, around audit, around controls, around security, around networking, how do we connect it on-prem, etc., around IAM, logging, blah, blah, blah. So what the proposal was that we would build a platform, which we call Atlas today. I'm sure it will have changed by the time I'm off this call. And that platform will essentially be opinionated, and it will be a build on top of what is I like to call the naked or vanilla AWS account or Google account and Azure account as we're going towards. And they will have opinionated products, they will have opinionated roles, they will be integrated with some on-prem tools, and a lot of those problems that could have been solved independently by each team will be solved once by a core team. We can work with our partners in cyber, security, audit, and get products signed off to be consumed. So what we really do is, rather than saying to our application development teams, you want an S3 bucket, go use S3, what we do is we provide a derivative of S3, which we probably just call S3, which will be a opinionated, locked down version of S3. Nothing surprisingly, but for example, by default, there will not be public access on those S3 buckets. They will not be allowed sharing with accounts that are out with our AWS organization, those kind of things. We will set up the network connectivity, the direct connect, all the stuff that I don't actually know that much about. We will create all that connectivity between your private VPC and the public, and the on-prem cloud that we are building. Sorry, private's not the right word. The VPC that we create with the private and the public subnets to connectivity to the on-prem offering. That's probably the context of what Atlas is and where we are. Sorry, one thing I should say to give you an idea of scale. We have 800, and I pulled this stat just recently, we have 827 dev AWS accounts. So what that means is that there's 827 accounts that we've categorized as development use, where we've put our Atlas platform onto it. It's paved, as we call it, with that opinionated set. So there's up to 827 teams using it. There will not be 827 because some will have more than one. There's 220 in test and 254 in prod. And that's now across 5 different regions. So we're multi-region as well.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea of the kind of scale. Okay.
In terms of, the compute venues, regions, and data centers and multiple cloud providers, could you share a little bit what you're doing now and the plans? Because you talked a lot about AWS. I know there's a wider plan for more venues. Yeah,
so I'm not so privy to it, but and I don't think any of this is private information, so I'm kind of comfortable to share at a higher level. I think there's been agreement that we cannot just use one provider. We must use multiple providers so that we don't have that single dependency. So as a result, we have our private cloud solution. We have the first of the more mature offering in public cloud is Amazon, AWS, but we are now also got a program on Google and a very, very immature, maybe I shouldn't say that, but a very, very start of Azure looking at as well. So there is the desire to have a multi-cloud provider solution.
Yeah. Cool. All right. I mean, so you mentioned Atlas, and you kind of you also walked through a few of the workflows that you do. And if you can imagine and think about how it was before Terraform, right? I mean, you probably used the service catalog, tell us a little bit about the problems that you had to deal with, your life.
Yep,
before.
I can go into that in detail. I'm hoping not bore you guys too much, but it's actually around about the same time I joined the public cloud space. So when I joined, there wasn't 800 dev accounts. Let's say, for argument's sake, there was 100 dev accounts, 20 test accounts, and 10 prod accounts, which is probably where we were around about 2 years ago. And you're right, we use the service catalog in AWS. So for people who are not familiar with service catalog, basically it's a way of creating a middleman. Rather than just calling EC2 directly, you can provision a product in service catalog. So your role gets permission to provision from service catalog, and then that launches with a launch role, which has the ability to call the underlying EC2 permissions. But what that means is that we can control the parameters through the service catalog, which is expressed in CloudFormation, and we can basically say you're only allowed to use certain functionality. We can put validation in that as well, and we can basically lock down, for want of a better term, what can be used. So that's what service catalog is. Service catalog is complex. It's fine from a one account perspective, if I'm being honest with you. The idea, I guess, Amazon thought with it, okay, the example I read at the time was, let's say you want to allow your developers to use public cloud and you give them an AWS account. You can use service catalog to maybe prohibit the types of instances they use. So they're only allowed to use cheap instances and not the high expensive ones or whatever. And that kind of works okay when you've got one account. But when we've got 100 accounts in those days, what we actually had to do was install that service catalog 100 times. It was like a redundant copy job. So it was like a cascade. Well, it wasn't even a cascade. What we had is we had the CloudFormation templates in our Bitbucket and our internal repos, and we had Jenkins type style jobs that would iterate over each of the accounts that we consider to be dev and install that service catalog one by one. And that's where it started. As you can imagine, that's not very scalable. So even when I came in, those 70 accounts, there was a job that would start up, take the service catalog, install it on account one. Once that's finished, install it on account two. Now, there was potential for us, and then we would do that in test and prod. Test and prod, less of a concern because they were smaller, but it's the same mechanism. The problem we had there was scale already, and it was immediately obvious that we were already maintaining a lot of state at the start. We were having to know which accounts were which and which ones we had to update. There was the real chance of drift. Things could be not updated, etc. So we moved to a mechanism called hub and spoke. Hub and spoke is actually an AWS pattern rather than a product as such. And really what they do is, if we take my 100, 20, 10, rather than have 100 dev accounts, I then have 101. The one account is a special account called a hub. And what I do is I copy my service catalog onto that hub, and that hub is then responsible for distributing it to its 100 children. And there's that relationship is maintained within that hub. So the state moves away from us on-prem having to hold it in files, etc. And the spokes know about their children, the children know about their parents. And that gave us some time. That allowed us to do a release. And we still have that mechanism for our service catalog offering, which we still have. The Terraform one we'll talk about in a moment. So our release mechanism then became, we would update the hub and it would then cascade that down to its spokes. Under the hood, that was just stack set operations, stack set instances, and it would be throttled by Amazon. So what would happen is that we would find that when we did that, it actually did them in tranches of 50. So we did have a level of parallelism, but it was only to 50. Now, as we scaled further to the point of where we are now, where we've got 800 of them, that would essentially be 16 tranches. We've worked with Amazon, they've now made it 100 in a tranche, so it's slightly better, but we still have 8 tranches to go through that. Long, boring story, apologies, and then we have to do that in our test environment, we have to do that in our prod environment, and all our environments, because all those dev, test, and prods are our customers. Dev, test, and prod, they're my prod, so they're all my prod. So we're now coming to the point where this isn't going to scale either. It's bought us time that rather than it being a linear growth that was like this, it was kind of slowed it down a little bit. But ultimately, this idea of making a copy of the service catalog in every account is a nightmare. And this is where we started to move towards Terraform. So Terraform, what we hope instead is, rather than having an S3 product copied into a service catalog copied into everyone's account, we will put it into a private module registry, which is hosted once, and then all the customers can consume from that private module registry in Terraform. And that means that my release to do the new version of the S3 product takes me 5 minutes and not the 8 hours that it actually takes at the moment.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
quite a monologue. I do apologize, but that's kind
great.
of that's our journey.
It's the typical, it's a typical scaling challenge, right? When you do something for one handful of flows, it's fine. But then when you need to do for the masses, for the hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands, you need to think differently about the problem, right? That's kind of how
completely
how I would summarize it.
And also, and there's another dimension is that the service catalog is actually scoped to the region. So even when once we brought in these new regions, we didn't just, an account didn't just have one service catalog, it would have 5 service catalogs, one for each of its 5 regions. So that copy mechanism then became like multi-dimensional. So now when I get the stats from my guys, it's not just like there's 827 accounts. Well, actually there's 827 accounts in US East 1, there's 74 in US East 2 or whatever, and it's just became a bit of a nightmare, to be honest with you. And obviously, and I'm going to start selling Terraform a little bit here, but the service catalog offering is AWS. Hub and Spoke is AWS. It's not cloud agnostic. So what we are thinking is that if we can use a tool like Terraform, which gives us benefit, the HCL language, etc., that becomes something common that the teams who may have a hybrid solution or want to have multi-cloud will have one way of deploying, rather than, oh, we do CloudWatch service catalog with something we built called Scepter over here, and then we have something different in Google. So we've used Terraform to kind of give a kind of a holistic approach in a single, consistent manner for deployment of your infrastructure.
Yeah. Basically, that's some of the sound. So a little bit about the your process to select Terraform. Like, how did you end up? Did you do a POC, bake off? How did you compare, or how did you end up using Terraform when you did in the beginning?
So I'm going to pass that question to Larry, because I wasn't really around. I'm taking credit for it as if, oh yes, I agree, I do this. It was actually, it predated my involvement. So Larry, I think you probably better answer that.
Yeah, sure. So in JP Morgan's public cloud journey, the vision that we defined is, first of all, multi-cloud, being able to have a pathway to consume different cloud providers for resiliencies, and not to be buying into any specific providers, and also leverage any of those services that they've got. Now, underpinning that, we would like to do things fast, but we need to do it accurately in a secure manner. And in a way, how do you actually translate developers' experience in terms of engaging the ecosystem of consuming public cloud infrastructure? Put it that way. So security and controls is first and foremost the very first thing that we always think about. It's not just go consume it and have it your way. It's always we always think about governance, think about audit trails and that kind of thing forward. On top of that, how can we actually build a pathway so that application teams have a means of accelerating their infrastructure needs into the public cloud? Now, to Chris's point, most of public cloud providers have templated solutions, things like service catalog, etc., but they're all proprietary to the cloud providers themselves. Now, that is not going to scale in terms of us operating against a different provider, because then users themselves, operators like ourselves, will have to deal with the underlying differences in the syntactic specification of such infrastructure layout. And that's where Terraform selling point comes in. Because of its cloud agnostic HCL nature, yes, you still write things to the resource specification against the cloud provider, but the syntax is the same, which means the tooling, the engagement, the ecosystem around experience. Well, if I go to Google, I will still write HCL. If I go to Google, Azure, I will still write HCL. The Sentinel policies that are being offered, right, or the policies that is going to be enforced on us, can validate against the HCL and the plans that were that was being defined. That's one. And we also want a consistent manner of identifying and specifying repeatable infrastructure in the same way. So Terraform lends handy in that you can define modules and share them around. Yes, it's HCL. You have modules for Google, you have modules for other cloud providers, etc. But you still specify HCL underneath the hood. To the users, it is passing input, getting outputs, getting resource, pay. My infrastructure needs is done. Give me the information of what is important to me, like the endpoints and everything, so I can deploy my app and get it through there. So multi-cloud, consistent developer experience in several realms. So developer experience comes in the form of users consuming, writing Terraform to do that. People who have identified blueprints, repeatable infrastructure, publishing them as patterns for general consumption. Cybersecurity guys, audit people, people who are concerned about controls, they weigh in with the specification of Sentinel policies, publish them, and they get enforced. Right, the experience is the same to a developer. You get your plan validated, and then if they pass, you get to apply. That is the main driver behind the scenes. Then at that point in time, when we look at other tools, there were really not many around. I mean, there are things like Pulumi that comes up, but Terraform is far more ahead in terms of provider offerings and the popularity and stability in terms of contribution to code and keeping up with provider new services and features. That's how we actually ended up with Terraform as the ideal solution to meet our vision for that.
Yeah. It's kind of a unified workflow to abstract the specific implementation and apply common features like control, governance, audit, RBAC, and so on.
Yes. Yeah. So if you think about, JP Morgan is a very large company with many developers. Like it would be difficult for them to just go and learn all the diverse languages and all the diverse template infrastructure, templating technologies, and to do it. But if you give them a consistent one, then the level of engagement and knowledge will stay intact with the same, and then they will just learn whatever that's necessary for that specific domain against the cloud provider, which is much easier thing to do than an exponentially difficult one to pick up a new language every time you go to a different provider.
I think one point I would add, and I don't know if it was even considered at the time, maybe we've just been lucky, but it's like any new technology that comes out. I guess you buy a ticket and take a bet. You hope that it becomes successful, because you basically, when people learn, so like when Larry and people in the team learn this, essentially we're investing in those people to build up those skills, okay? But over time, we want to be able to recruit people with those skills, and what we're seeing is that we can actually find people who have Terraform skills. Have we used maybe something that was a bit less well known, then we probably have to build that from a person. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like we only recruit people who have those skills, but it's definitely beneficial when we found people who have already used Terraform, that it's something you see on CVs and that we can bring people in with that knowledge. So again, it's kind of market leader advantage, I guess, from that. You can see it similar with Java. I think Java became very successful because so many people could do it as much as anything else. It became the kind of lingua franca, is that the term? That meant that so many people could do it, which helps when you're recruiting people rather than looking for code developers, for example.
Yeah, thank you. A few questions from folks. I don't know if this is still, you still remember, if it's not too long, but there's a question from Itai. How did you manage the migration from previous solutions, for example, the hub and spoke and service catalog, to TFE? How, was it seamless, baby steps, big bang? How do you manage it?
It's a very good question, and it's not one that we can say that we can put in the past, because it's not been sorted. So one of the things that we had at the point when we started to use Terraform and put our investment into Terraform modules, we had a decision to make. One of them could have been, let's take what's in service catalog and make an equivalent product within Terraform. And that would have been good in the sense that you could have said to people, stop using that old stuff, it's deprecated. But what the decision we ended up going with was that people wanted other things unlocked. So what we started to do is we started to unlock new services in Terraform. So that incentivized people who wanted to use, I don't know, Redshift, Elasticache, some of the stuff that we didn't have in service catalog, they were incentivized to use Terraform. But we had a hybrid model effectively. If you wanted your auto-scaling group and you wanted an Elasticsearch, you kind of had to have a foot in both, which isn't an ideal solution. What I guess as a corporate decision that meant we could give new functionality to people, which unlocked more use cases. We're now kind of probably going back and starting to say, right, let's take those products that are in service catalog and migrating them into Terraform. So that's now underway and is quite far underway. What we've tried to do is incentivize people again by making better products, or when new features come in, only put it in the strategic one. Now, that doesn't always happen, but you can see, but we're starting to kind of say, right, use that one, use that one. Yeah. Migration isn't easy. I don't know if we can migrate, if I'm being honest with you. When it comes to things that are stateless, so like transient stuff like EC2 instances, auto-scaling groups, even like maybe like things that don't have data in them, we're probably just encouraging people to just build another one and abandon their old one. We're not trying to do any sort of state transition. We're not trying to say this was owned by a stack in CloudFormation and now we're going to import it into Terraform. We've not done that. With the stuff that's got state in it, like RDS databases, S3, etc., I think we will probably try and get people to migrate using like kind of database migration services and moving things within S3 buckets. If I'm being honest with you, I don't think we've answered all the hard questions on that because I think we would. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't think we've really thought out how can we actually take ownership from something that used to be infrastructure as code defined in CloudFormation and migrate it over. I think we're trying to avoid that as much as possible.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
I'm afraid.
Fair enough. All right. Next question is a little bit on the not the ecosystem, but the environment. So, do you integrate Terraform with other configuration tools like Chef, Puppet, and Ansible?
Larry, is that something you maybe?
Yeah, so this is probably more on configuring things like EC2 instances, etc. There are some elements of those things, but what we have more is on things like opinionated forms of code deployment. So we try to actually not have the users themselves having to provision even the underlying EC2 instances themselves with user data and everything like that much. Instead, they rely on the standard mechanisms of code delivery through things like AWS Code Deploy, and then they will just bootstrap their things out there. But it is not in our platform's concern to say, well, you can only just do that. If there's a means to actually need to hook on the configuration management tools like Chef and Puppet, they're always free to do so in terms of EC2. If they have the software installed, then by all means, you can push your configuration management of Puppet through Code Deploy and then just Puppet apply on that thing. So we don't actually impose on the user to say, well, this is no for you. We try to open that up as much as possible. And if there's a means for them to do so, and if there's any use case for them for that to happen, then they can always do that. Of course, then the versions of the Ansibles and the software would have to go through secured means and say, yes, you can use this specific versions and things like that. They will have to qualify those security and audit concerns and then get permit to use and just run with it.
You mean you're open? It's an application team effort to integrate and do the specific configuration to their endpoint. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. A question from Ryan Garrett. That's an interesting one. Could you talk about the culture changes and the challenges you have experienced or still experiencing as you are evolving with the infrastructure as code and the provisioning? And
this is more just my opinion and maybe some of my musings as much as anything else, but I feel as though a developer's life has got a little bit harder in some ways. I think using what's happened is that maybe I'm showing my age, but in the old days, an application developer would build their web app or whatever, and they wouldn't be too concerned about the infrastructure. There would essentially be another infrastructure team that would do that for them. but they would all moan because it would taken too long to get the infrastructure. So as this infrastructure as code appeared, it became something that the developers could then provision for themselves, and it basically made those people redundant, maybe in some ways. But it meant that the developers had to pick up more responsibility for things that they maybe used to take for granted. So I would argue, and this is just my opinion, and doesn't reflect the firm in any way, but I feel as though it's actually made it harder to be a developer because you need to know more, but you have more power and you've got more flexibility and you can do things faster. But I think that you need to know more about the full stack now than maybe you previously had to.
Yeah, I agree on that. So it's consuming the cloud is just not just throwing you a bunch of templates and say go, right? You need to know if you're consuming EC2 instances, then you need to know how these thing works so that you are able to actually pass in the right parameters to influence how your infrastructure is going to act against your application, for that matter. So you can't just go to AWS and say, right, okay, just deploy my app. No, there are security groups concerned, IAM, permission sets that you need to actually comprehend. And that's beyond just knowing how to use Terraform. You need to use Terraform with contextual knowledge against the cloud provider that you want to consume the services on, how to actually configure them. The modules will offer an accelerated path, provided you also know that you're passing the right values in. Right? Because we say, well, we've got the modules that create security groups for you, but you need to know the semantics of the parameters that you are passing in order to have meaningful things provision. Otherwise, your app couldn't talk to something, and you have a lot of problems fighting this path and this journey towards that. And of course, Terraform is more about automation. Just Terraform apply and things will pull through. Developers previously come from let's just go to the console, click a few buttons and do that. And you need to translate that mindset off to automating things. So you need to deal with CLIs, you need to deal with APIs, how do you actually orchestrate that, and then build your continuous integration and delivery so that your dev, test, and prod have a repeatable means of producing the same things that your application needs. So is that kind of mindset of transition that takes a bit of a learning curve, because it's compounded by learning Terraform syntax, learning how Terraform Enterprise work, the ecosystem we built around them, how do you actually discover modules, which modules to actually consume, and then on top of that, cloud providers semantics in the domain. So yeah, like to Chris's point, they need to know more instead of just less, but then they can automate more things.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I look, we're generalizing, right? We're generalizing, but my take on that is it's never been easier to go quick and self-service and do stuff, but actually it is probably never been harder to actually know what is happening behind the scenes, and if something goes wrong, to go and troubleshoot and get to levels where you can get out of a situation. So developers need to know more in case they need to know it, right?
As a platform, I guess it's some part of what we're doing as well. As we mature, we don't want to take away from developers, but if you're building a vanilla web app with an RDS Oracle database, we do kind of want to provide a blueprint pattern which allows you to do next quite a lot and fill in a few blanks. A bit like, I guess, what Amazon are doing with like Elastic Beanstalk. We kind of want to do something like that. But it is a balance, because as you say, something goes wrong, you're like, right, okay, I now need to know what's inside the black box. And it's a black box, so it's a little bit harder. But I mean, like, even if I think about my own experience, when I worked at JP Morgan, I came back to JP Morgan 6 years ago, we had a system that was very elastic by nature. It was a trading tool, but basically it was idle. And then all of a sudden there'd be an event that said, let's do lots of calculations. And in the old world, we basically had the kit to deal with the spike. We had the kit to cope with the elastic spike. Nowadays, we wouldn't need that. We could just say, right, it can be an idle web app doing nothing with 7 people every now and again looking at a report. But as soon as someone presses that big button that says, here's the event we want to do the calculation on, it could spin up. And that was something that 6 years ago possibly was available in the greater world, but for us, it was still not really something we could use. So we had idle hardware sitting there. I used to kind of anthropomorphize it and talk about how our servers were bored. You know, nowadays we would just say, okay, you've got one instance doing nothing, and then let it spin up, and it can spin up as much as we need. So this gives you a lot of power.
Yes. Yeah, good call. All right, moving on. So I have a question here from James Wong. Are the Terraform modules mandatory for app teams to use? If yes, how do you enforce that?
Yes, they are, and we enforce that using Sentinel. So there's a Sentinel policy that basically checks that when you try to use one of the modules, that it comes from the private module registry. So they're basically, if you tried to use something that wasn't the private module registry, the Sentinel policy would reject it. We also have, and I'm not going to talk about it too much, but we also have a bunch of like other cyber type controls that control what instances are allowed to make commands, etc. So we've closed down a lot of the kind of extensibility of it.
Makes sense. Yeah, that's what Sentinel is there for.
Yeah, and Sentinel, I mean, we've not really talked about Sentinel, but Sentinel is something that we've got great hopes for, because we can, and the model that we have at the moment, or previous to Sentinel, we would, on day one, I would maybe prove to Cyber that my EC2 implementation has these controls in place, but that's essentially a bunch of screenshots and evidence from a point in time. With Sentinel, our hope is that we can have tests that run all the time, and they can continue to prove that new versions haven't broken a control, that control is still in place, and then we can use that as an audit point. Now that's a very, very large goal, and it's probably a little bit beyond where it is at the moment, but that's where we're aiming for, that we can have repeatable, ongoing unit tests that prove the policy, rather than just saying, oh yeah, on the 23rd of March when Chris showed me it, it worked, rather than 3 years later we know it's still there.
Okay, next question from Ryan Russell. I'd be interested to know if you managed to get any sort of code coverage test or testing for Sentinel policy during your SDLC.
I don't actually know the answer to that. I know that the bit that I look after is actually look after the Terraform instance, and the team who provide the modules and write the policies are actually a different team. I understand that they do have these unit tests that run all the time. I couldn't tell you what the coverage is. I presume it's good, because we have some controls that make sure that there has to be a certain coverage before things can go live. But I don't know the answer to that. Larry, do you know?
But there is code coverage that is enforced by the policy authors, and as part of, it's kind of a gate before you can go live.
Yeah, well, we usually just do positive and negative testing in terms of the against the Sentinel policy, usually with the modules in question that will be subjected to the Sentinel policies for analysis, and at least they will give us, a known path, knowing that the modules once published will go through okay or not, depending on how the Sentinel policies evaluated out. Code coverage, I don't think they have a line by line to say, well, that if statement hasn't been traversed, that kind of thing is usually probably have to capture in a few executions to just tease that out.
Yeah, okay.
I'll try logging into my VDI and asking one of my colleagues whilst we're doing this and see if I can get an answer for you.
Yeah, that's great.
I'm multitasking, so apologies.
So I'm going to ask, I'm going to move on and ask about the whole of innovation, right? I mean, we are very honored that HashiCorp as a vendor and Terraform as a product were selected. It's really good. Tell us a little bit about the concept of the Hall of Innovation and the Hall of Fame, and what do you do and how you what does it actually mean for you internally, and what does it mean for you that Terraform and HashiCorp were selected?
Sure, let me answer that, and I'll go back to my other task in a second. Right, so I was the guy who presented to the board who helped pick this. So to give some context, JP Morgan has a Hall of Innovation award. This is the 12th, we just had the 12th annual award, so I guess it's been put in place 12 years ago. And I guess the idea behind that was that they wanted to I guess, put out some nice feeling and reward people and say, look, we think this is something that we think is valuable, it's helping us. Rather than me paraphrasing it, let me actually read what it says. So it recognizes companies that go above and beyond in delivering disruptive technology and creating business value for JPM Chase. So I was asked to present, and that's like our, I don't even remember what they're called, is it the G Talk or the Global, the head of the people, Guy, you might even remember, but the head people at JP Morgan in terms of technology. So I was asked to present to them. I had a 7-minute slot because when you get to that level of importance, that's what you get. And I had a presentation to say what I thought of Terraform and Hashi in general. And to kind of put it down, it helped us to standardize our public and private infrastructure provisioning, future-proofing us in a modernization journey, cloud agnostic, etc. So they don't get given out easily. I mean, I'm looking at some of the people who've had them before: Armory for Spinnaker, Confluent, Cockroach, Delphix. There's a bunch of firms that have had these before. So it's like it's a very, I'll say prestigious award, but I'm guessing, I mean, it's a great bit of recognition from a big bank like us who are saying, yeah, we're using this and we're using it at enterprise level. And I guess it's a little bit of a thank you for all the good work that the Hashi partners have put in for us. And I'll tell you the other thing, they must have been good because I gave the presentation. I've told this story to the Terraform people before, but I thought the people on the end of the presentation looked so bored. I was the last person up, and I thought they looked so bored. I thought there was no chance. But obviously, the content of the material that was presented was enough to get the award. So it definitely wasn't my presentation skills that got it. So well done.
In spite of.
Yeah, in spite of me, you still managed to get an award.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. That's great. I see a question from Brad. I'm gonna, while you wait for answer on the VDI.
Yeah.
Or do you have it?
No, I'm not actually trying to. Yeah, no,
as a traditional infrastructure team, whatever that means in that context, does the traditional infrastructure team have any play in this, or is the code owned mostly by developers? I
would say, and I think Larry will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's more the latter. The developers own them. I guess as a platform, we provide an element of kind of infrastructure team. So we have to look at what these products are, decide how we like open up network connectivity to them. Like, for example, we don't let people just create security groups. We have opinionated what they're allowed to do in terms of security groups. Some of them are installed by default as part of our product. So we kind of perform that role. But I'm guessing in the same way that maybe if you had a web page to order a VSI in the past, the infrastructure team would have created that service. We perform that role. The developers themselves kind of own the code that then provisions them, but they don't have carte blanche. They can't just go in and say, I want an EC2 and I want it to be like this, and I want this network connectivity. In fact, they've got very, very little levers at all on their VPC. I think that's a fair statement, Larry. I mean, they can pick how big they want the CIDR range to be and a few other things, but it's very locked down. So they don't have full control.
So the general approach that we have is, by all means, the code is collectively owned by everyone in JP Morgan as long as you have a means to actually contribute to it in the way that has been approved. So, the Sentinel policies will have to weigh in. And if you need, say, traditional infrastructure needs, not consuming providers, then by all means, develop your own provider, use the approved or source the ones that are already out there, bring them to system under the approval checklist. And once they're at go, you can actually translate your application needs using Terraform for your traditional infrastructure needs if you want to. I mean, that's how Terraform works generally as a plugin infrastructure. So we're not denying any of these for that. But of course, safe, secure is always the foremost thing that we think about. So Sentinel rules and governance will always have to apply.
Yeah, and it kind of lends itself for sharing, right? Unlike quote unquote traditional, where this is your technical domain expertise and you own the scripts to configure the hypervisors, and you will consume tickets from a queue to provision, then it's now open and not open source, but kind of open collaboration.
Yes.
People can augment it, enhance it, be inspired by it and so on.
That will foster a lot more collaboration and the maturity of the code itself, getting right and more efficient.
It's probably fair to say, Larry, and I apologize, I'm trying to get Scott some time, but there's another Terraform instance within JP Morgan, and it's actually used for private infrastructure, and that's actually, I think, owned by what you would probably think of as more traditional infrastructure teams. So we don't get too involved in that, and maybe one day we will marry these together, but at the moment they're separate. So we're probably talking about the public cloud stuff only, but there are people who are using Terraform for, I guess we call traditional infrastructure.
Yeah, and then an application owner either binds to the public cloud Terraform or the on-prem Terraform, depending on their target compute, right?
Yep, it depends on endpoint of consumption. Then you choose the appropriate engagement route.
Okay. So I have a question from Cordell. How is JP Morgan implementing Terraform modules? Is JP Morgan implementing modules, and how?
Yes, we are, because we install the modules into the private module registry. So that's how, so if, for example, if our customers want to use S3, which is, as you can imagine, they do, we have an S3 module in our private module registry that the customer can consume. I'm not sure if I understand the question of how. I guess we have an organization, a Terraform organization, which is denoted as our special private module registry organization. And that's where we deploy those things to. And then our customers on the different organization can then consume from that and must consume from that. I think, and I don't know if I'm trying to second guess where the question came from. And recently we've now got the ability for API builds to do cross org connectivity so that you can consume modules from a different org. We had to do it through the CLI before, but now it's through the API as well. I don't know if that
probably a little bit more extension on the how part is probably from the perspective of a module author, creating blueprints for them. We actually, as a platform, have a SDLC pipeline for module development, and then you actually create and define those modules, and they work their way up into the promotion process of getting themselves into the private module registry for consumption. So that means it goes through the packaging process, and also run the test against the Sentinel policy to say, well, this module is defined, and there's no regression against the existing set of Sentinel policies involved, and then you promote it and stage it for promotion into general consumption by the users themselves. So if that's the how, that's how we are doing it.
Yeah, that's how I would interpret the question, kind of like, the framework and workflows, policies, and capability you have around, module authors and how they can publish and consume and collaborate with other blueprint and module authors.
Yeah, at the same time, we wouldn't want just anyone to arbitrarily publish into the module registry in order to find out that it's not working, and that would just lead to inefficiency in terms of people discovering it and only to find out it's not working. So this sort of process would give us a means to ensure that we tested it and its quality is ascertained before we give it to the users themselves. So the collaboration starts, we push left a lot more on the collaboration phase and make sure that adheres to all the security controls and everything as well. Meeting them so they know when users consume them, they know that this thing is a certified product or certified from JP Morgan's perspective.
Yeah, because you don't own all the modules, but you own the process and the governance to make sure that modules behave nicely.
Yes, right? Otherwise it would just come down to the 5, 10, 20 people who write modules. It's not going to actually scale well in terms of the amount of cloud provider services that we would like to have acceleration to.
Yeah, and frankly, this is one of the values, right? And going back to the point earlier about the developer, the mind shift and the culture shift. If developers consume more modules and operate at higher level, they would need to do less and know less. Versus, a very raw self-service that is open but low level that you need to really interact with things
Yeah,
that
so
you wouldn't
if
otherwise.
you want to define our role down here as a platform offering, we're more like the facilitator. We facilitate so that you have a known path to creating modules in a safe and secure way, and then the contributions can come from people, the community within JP Morgan's engineer to make that happen, and that way we
Yeah,
get more acceleration.
I think this kind of answers also the next question from James Wong. Do you have one-size-fits-all modules, or how do you manage exceptions? I think we kind of you describe the process, and I don't know what exception means in this context.
Maybe what I could answer is like how I interpret this is that what I envisage for us to be as an engineering team providing modules is I envisage us to be as thin and as non-obtrusive, I think is that the right word, non-obtrusive as possible. The more that we put in, the further we take it away from the basic provider. So I want to only put stuff in there that's a control or there for a reason. So for example, S3 buckets, you cannot make them public access. It's pretty much a rule that we have. No one's came along with an exception saying we want to host a public website yet. Now, if they did, then that's maybe a question to have to look at. But we try to put those controls in that are necessary. We don't try and limit, like if you want to spin up 100 instances of this certain size, that's your lookout. You'll pay for it ultimately, so you do that. So we don't have like extremely opinionated. The narrower we make this, the more work we make for ourselves, because people will ask, or oh, I need this new service, or I've got this reason to not do it. So the rationale that we try and do is keep it as thin as a facade as possible, so that we're not making it incredibly different to what the underlying AWS provider would give you. And that's kind of what we're trying to go to.
Yeah. I have one more question here. I think we have time for one more question. So this is about CMDB from Alberto Cortes.
Yep.
Do you have any automatic integration with CMDB for infrastructure you build using Terraform?
Yes and no. So I can't talk about too much detail, but we have in some places we have to register things so that, for example, connecting to remote EC2 instances can be controlled and monitored and logged, and traceability logs can be captured. But we don't have absolutely every single service and every single thing that you can provision automatically feeding to a CMDB solution. We definitely don't have that. There's a few things in the bank that are competing to be that. One of which is something that we're looking to build ourselves for our own platform and SRE team, where we're hoping to leverage AWS config and extend AWS config so that we can effectively pull the state of the whole account organization and pull out, every product that's in there and get a view. And, I have a kind of Grafana type front end to it so that we can actually look at what's there and drill into it. That's more for us to, I guess, from observability and inventory purposes. We do have some for control purposes already, but that's where we're going to at the moment. But okay. I would say that we're trying to do that independent of Terraform as well, because at the moment we've got service catalog products and we have Terraform products. We don't want to have a solution that means only Terraform products are captured. We kind of almost want to, as I call it, spill your guts. We kind of almost want to query an account and say, tell me what you've got. And then we can pull that information from it. And then that could be the source of a CMDB solution ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that was a hard question. Didn't like that.
All right, great. So Chris, Larry, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you very, very much for the time and all the details and overview and answering all the questions from the audience. Thanks to everybody who joined us today. I'll pass over back to Hope to wrap it up. And
awesome.
See you next time.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, everybody. Great questions. And just so Larry and Chris know, lots of great feedback from the attendees coming and thanking you for your time and your insights and being open to answer all these questions. So awesome. More success ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.